My name is Bryce Wakefield, and I'm the CEO of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. As you also probably know, this is a membership organisation, and it's great to see so many members here, as well as fellows of the AIIA. If you're not a member, then why not? Please sign up at your earliest convenience. And also welcome Excellencies. I'd like, before we get started, of course, to pay my respects to the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people, this being the traditional lands of those people, and to their elders, past, present, and emerging. It's interesting times, of course, in the United States, where our guest is from. But within the United States and globally, I think there's kind of a consensus that Australia is more important, perhaps, than it was a few years or a decade ago or so. And there are people popping up all over Washington, I think, claiming to have the first program on Australian studies, dedicated program in Washington. I remember going back to Washington to talk to people at an institute that has, in fact, been there for a long time. I first went to Washington in 2003 or 2, I think, to talk to a gentleman called Dick Tier at the Centre for Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Studies. And then I was very fortunate to work in Washington from 2009 to 2012, where I met my good friend Alan Tidwell, who is the speaker today. And I'm pleased to report that actually there has always been a presence in Washington that is dedicated to looking at Australia before it was cool, and Alan is part of that legacy. So Alan, and many of you know Alan, of course, is the director of the Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Studies Centre at Georgetown University. He's had a career where he's also lectured here in Australia, and he's also worked at the US Institute of Peace, which of course is an institute for all the wrong reasons, which has been in the news as of late. Today, he's going to talk about US policy, hot topic at the moment, of course, why US Pacific policy can't escape its past and why it matters for Australia. Before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. Those of you online, of course, you're always welcome to submit a question even when Alan is talking through the Q&A function on Zoom. We will enable, although we haven't yet, but we will enable the upvote function. So if you see a question that you like, please click the thumbs up button and it will float to the top of the list, and we will choose whether or not we should ask it. So without further ado, Alan, could you come up and take the podium? Thanks.
Bryce, thanks very much. It's wonderful to be here in Canberra at the Institute. And Bryce, it's fantastic to see you again and to hear your good news. And I'm looking forward to catching up more about the past years. We'll just leave it at years. Okay, fair enough. So as Bryce said, my name is Alan Tidwell. I direct the Center for Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Studies at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. And we have been recently really overwhelmed by student interest in the Pacific. And so that's been an interesting jumping off point for us. And Washington has been a place that has recently been filled with stories of the Pacific. One only need to think back of September in 2022 and think about the news that was being created at the White House with the Pacific Leaders Meeting, with President Joe Biden hosting Pacific Island leaders, and the excitement that happened in Washington when they published their first Pacific Island strategy, and the expectation that somehow we had turned a corner on U.S. engagement in the Pacific Islands. And I have to say, in the midst of all of that excitement, I was looking out with perhaps a somewhat more disappointed perspective, because I thought that's the high point. This is about as good as it's going to get. And things haven't gone exactly to plan since then. But I'd like to talk a little bit about why I think Washington has been really captured by its past. and really been unable to engage with the Pacific effectively. And to do that, I thought what I might first do would be to talk a little bit about path dependency. And I know it's a bit of a wonky kind of term, and it's maybe even a little bit dated in one perspective, but I think touching on this notion of path dependency. Wait, we're waiting to change slides. There you go. Fantastic. Thank you. The notion of path dependency, I think, is an important concept just to grapple with. And it simply describes a situation in which a present state depends upon an event that occurred in history. And history is the arbiter, I suppose, in many respects of where we are institutionally today. And there are elements of path dependency that are worth pondering for just a moment. And one is that historical contingency. And the historical contingency that drives Pacific engagement in Washington is World War II, is the battle over being able to assert its strategic interests across the Pacific and contest Japan in East Asia and Southeast Asia. And that still is with us very much today. It's interesting that in the Pacific in particular, that American perspective towards the Pacific is captured by that moment. And it's captured in part by increasing returns. Careers are created on the back of being able to deliver institutional results around that strategic imperative. Strategic denial, the maintenance of American power in the Pacific feeds careers, and careers feed upon themselves. Institutions feed upon themselves. Budgets feed upon themselves. And so over time, that path dependency gets locked in. It becomes the norm. And that norm can deliver some very positive things, but it also can be blinding to other options and alternatives. It can blind one to innovation. Doing the same thing over and over again without consideration as to why one is doing it institutionally can simply lock in inefficient practices. It can lock in blindness. And my argument is that in large part, that's exactly what's happened in the Pacific. The United States hasn't really discovered the Pacific in any really meaningful way. And so reform is difficult. It's difficult to innovate. It's difficult to create new institutional settings for which the United States could engage with the Pacific. And in some, small, tiny decisions can have outsized consequences if not addressed, if not considered for their impact. And so I just want to have that notion of path dependence in your mind as we're thinking about what Washington has done in the Pacific and the way in which Washington has engaged in the Pacific. So let me now move to the next slide. There you go, it works. So if you think about the past three presidents, including the current president, so 4 administrations, 3 presidents, we see an underlying strategic logic, one single logic. And that logic is security. It is military access. It's strategic denial. It is about competition with the PRC. The Obama administration announced its pivot to Asia here in Canberra. That pivot to Asia was designed in large part around containment of the PRC. The first Trump administration picked up that strategic logic. It didn't change the logic, but the implementation of that logic was different. And the implementation of that logic was to counter China. But the rhetoric that surrounded that implementation was one of partnership. So if you go back to the Trump administration's rhetoric around engagement in the Pacific, it was one of partnership with the Pacific. So you think about, for instance, the Trump administration's partnership with Australia, New Zealand, and Japan on funding the electrification of Papua New Guinea. It was done in partnership. If you think about the ways in which the Trump administration worked with Australia and Japan on funding undersea cables, again, in partnership. The Biden administration, under the direction of Kurt Campbell, innovated that partnership, but it was still partnership. And it was Kurt Campbell's design to engage with the Pacific, but in a more comprehensive manner. And but again, through that partnership was, again, to counter China. And so that was the strategic objective, the impulse rather. But the underlying strategic logic, once again, is security, military access, strategic denial, and competition with China. Trump 2 administration, what is their Pacific policy? The Pacific policy still at the rhetorical level where you can find the rhetoric that enunciates that policy is one of partnership again. That's still the language. It's not clear precisely what the details of this policy will be, but even more pointedly now, it is strategic denial. We've moved from containment, from countering China to a more thorough strategic denial in the Pacific. But once again, it's the echoing of that same logic. Let me pause for just a second. I'm not suggesting for a moment that strategic denial and the security perspectives are necessarily misguided. What I'm suggesting, however, is that the United States has never sat and had a considered policy over how to engage with the Pacific. The Pacific is merely the chessboard, if you will, on which strategic denial is played out. But there hasn't been a consideration of how to develop partnership, relationship in the Pacific Islands. And that's really my focus in that point. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Trump administration. So what have they done in the Pacific? Well, you know kind of what they've done. I left the tariffs at the bottom, but maybe we could start with tariffs. So the process of putting a 10% tariff on all countries, inhabited or otherwise, was a Trump administration policy. I was I understand folks in Norfolk Island are thrilled that they get a larger tariff than New Zealand, but yeah, okay. I'm going to buy the T-shirt. But the Trump administration, of course, in eradicating, and I use that language pointedly, I mean, getting rid of USAID is striking. And the impact that that has had amongst Foreign Service officers in the State Department has been stunning. When you talk to people in the State Department, they talk about their colleagues losing their jobs in a way that no one had ever envisioned in public service is really quite stunning. The break of trust, I think, is overwhelming. And of course, Trump's strategic logic in all of this is, what can you do for the United States? What can you do for the United States? I would argue that the people working at USAID were doing everything they could for the United States, but that's just me. And of course, Trump withdrew from the Paris climate agreement. Everyone knew that was going to happen. I think that that's been accounted for in capitals across the Pacific. It's not a good thing to happen, but certainly it was one that wasn't a surprise. More surprising to me was the decision of the Trump administration through executive order to enunciate a policy on undersea mining. That was really interesting. I was not expecting that. And so the Trump administration has issued an executive order opening up U.S. EEZ to undersea mining for private sector exploitation. What's more interesting to my thinking is just a clause in that executive order where the White House urges the private sector not only to exploit the EEZ, but also the high seas. And that was a really interesting perspective, and an unfortunate one. It's an attack, in my mind, it's an attack on UNCLOS. It's an attack on the International Seabed Authority and the work that's being done in Kingston today. So that was really quite a surprise. And I should also point out that the Trump administration has also taken action in the Pacific on opening up one of the monuments in I can't remember the name. It's got a long name. I'm sorry, I can't remember. But opening up one of the monuments to American fishing as well. And so now you have fishing being undertaken in an undersea monument that had been closed to fishing for quite some time, since I think the Bush administration in around 2003 or 4. So, you know, there are a number of actions have been taken for the economic exploitation of the Pacific, but not a lot in terms of engaging with Pacific capitals. And I think that's really quite a striking thing. So the downsides are interrupting the development assistance, the provision of development assistance. The foreign assistance review has been extended by another 30 days. Originally, it was supposed to be concluded, I think it was 60 days ago, and we're now going to be up to a total of 90 days of extension. So it won't be until July that, in theory, we're supposed to have some word on what the foreign assistance decisions will be. And there are a couple of issues that hang in there that I think are really very important for the Pacific, not least of which is the Tuna Treaty. The United States has one multilateral agreement with the Pacific Island states, and that's the Tuna Treaty. And you know that the Tuna Treaty was the original payment by the United States was in the ballpark of $20 million a year. The Pacific asked for in the next round of negotiations, the opening gambit by the Pacific was $60 million a year. And the United States simply said, okay. And you can imagine, sort of the buyer's remorse that would have, cascaded across the table as, the United States said yes to the opening number. Why didn't we ask for more? But those funds haven't been dispersed. I believe funds were appropriated last year, but they've been impounded. And so it doesn't look like those funds are going anywhere anytime soon. If the United States decides not to fund the Tuna Treaty, I think that has significant regional consequences. To my mind, it would be a break of trust. It would also impact budgets in the Pacific Islands, I think, dramatically, as well as countries like Australia and New Zealand, who would then be asked, I think, to try to fill the gap in that funding hole. So, the Pacific Tuna Treaty hangs in the balance. Tariffs are costly, not directly to Pacific Island countries, but indirectly for their economic consequences and their impacts. The COFA states look like they're reasonably okay, except the one cut to FEMA that is really concerning is being able to the provision of emergency management services in the three compact states. So that's Dodge cutting back on the capacity of FEMA to actually deliver services, though the funds under the compact have been dispersed, and so that they're there. But it's the government services that also go in alongside of those funds that are, I think, of great concern. And then, of course, you worry about budget cuts to the Coast Guard. Will the Coast Guard continue to be able to operate at distance? They're currently operating 2 cutters in the region, and one worries about the ability to go ahead and finance the continued visits of Coast Guard cutters. That has impacts for IUU fishing. That has impacts for the implementation of the shipwriter agreements. And so I think in many respects, what leverage the United States has had in the Pacific is being quickly eroded by the Trump administration. And it's that erosion of leverage that is most concerning. If you want to look at some upsides, yeah, they knew about Pacific Island countries knew about the Paris withdrawal. The U.S. Papua New Guinea Defense Cooperation Agreement is in place. The petrol tanks, the contract for the petrol tanks has been let. So the United States is putting in large storage of petrol in Papua New Guinea, and that petrol can be used domestically as well as for U.S. military. So, I think that's a positive side that's moving forward. But nonetheless, I think things are certainly in flux and very complex for U.S. Pacific Island policy. The core of the things that haven't changed, though, and this goes back to my point about the continuing strategic logic, are 3 things. One is the importance of COFA and the strategic denial that the COFA states offers the United States and the North Pacific. The United States has the capacity to deny access to foreign powers to the COFA region. Secondly, the United States, as I'm sure you know, has an obligation to defend the COFA states as if they're the United States. And I just want to emphasize that point again. This is not Article 5, NATO Article 5. It says in the COFA agreements, you will defend the COFA states as if they are citizens and the territory of the United States. That's a very different defense obligation. A second component of U.S. Pacific policy is really the priority of U.S. Indo-PACOM. U.S. Indo-PACOM calls the tune, and they are, of the parties in the Pacific, they are perhaps the most influential party in the Pacific. And just as a reminder, I just want to read a quick quote from Admiral Paparo, commander of U.S. Indo-PACOM. The United States engages Pacific Island countries to support their ability to protect the sovereignty to protect their sovereignty against external threats and aggression. This engagement is a core effort to strengthen peace, stability, and deterrence across the Indo-Pacific region. So U.S. Indo-PACOM think the Pacific Islands are important. That was from testimony that Paparo provided to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And then the third component is the reliance upon Australia and New Zealand in the Pacific. And I think that those elements have not changed. And just to remind you, and I look at the people in the room, and I know some of you know this well and truly, but the United States looks to Australia and New Zealand to defend the Pacific, and Australia has recognized that importance. Andrew Peacock's 1977 statement to Cabinet, the U.S. looks to Australia and New Zealand to shoulder the main burden of ensuring stability in the region and of developing close relations with island countries. But the flip side of that is Dick Armitage's comment. Armitage says, you'll remember the former Deputy Secretary of State of the U.S. Under the George W. Bush. Armitage says, don't understand the South Pacific? Happy to leave it with you. Not engaged. Don't want to know, you do it. So Australia is in fact, in many respects, the Washington Pacific whisperer. I would describe Australia that way today. I cannot tell you how many times I have heard Australian or New Zealand diplomats say the following: run it by us first. And the reply from Washington has been, okay, run it by us first, okay. And I think that reliance on Australia has been essential. It's interesting that I've not been able to find any statement by Australia that actually enunciates their encouragement of the United States to be engaged in the Pacific Islands. But Winston Peters, in December of 2018, at an address for Georgetown University, said the following. He said, "We unashamedly ask for the United States to engage more, and we think it's in your vital interest to do so. And time is of the essence." But that same message is repeated in the out of the embassy in Washington, the Australian embassy in Washington. The idea of encouraging Washington to engage more frequently, more deeply with the Pacific. And what's interesting is that under the leadership of Kurt Campbell and the Biden administration was in fact an incorporation of the Pacific Island Forum 2050 strategy as an important benchmark for U.S. engagement in the Pacific Islands. It's the first time that I can think of where the United States preferred its engagement with the Pacific Island Forum over engagement with the Pacific community. The United States is a member of the Pacific community. It's not a member of the Pacific Island Forum. And so by habit, by tradition, it's always been the Pacific community was the place where Washington engaged. It was their club. But the Pacific Island Forum, according to the Pacific Island Strategy published by the Biden White House in 2022, the Pacific Island Forum is the preferred regional body with which to engage. So Australia has put itself, I think, in a really interesting position by looking at engaging with Washington on the Pacific has been a way of course, adding value to the bilateral relationship. It's been a way of furthering Australian interests, protecting Australian commitments in the Pacific. Australia has sometimes found itself at odds with the United States in some of their Pacific engagement, most notably over the Defense Cooperation Agreement with Papua New Guinea. If you talk to negotiators from the American side, they will talk about the perception of being white-handed by the diplomats from DFAT over the Defense Cooperation Agreement. But here we are. The DCA was signed. It's a deal now. But nonetheless, there was pushback, I think. It gets explained periodically as people at a lower level don't know what the score is. I'm not sure I really buy that, but okay. People can say whatever they want, but the idea that people on the ground may not have been up with what what Canberra is trying to do in Washington. But Australia also finds itself in a really difficult position today in Washington. Because what is the message? What is the message to Washington? Amidst the chaos, amidst all the turmoil, the budgeting turmoil, what would be the message that Australia would deliver? It's really difficult to know what that message would be, because I don't know that the White House or the NSC or anyone on Capitol Hill would necessarily be receptive, in part because they may not know the message either. They may not know the answer either. So, interesting times. So broadly speaking, though, we are in a position where we're driven mostly in the Pacific by strategic reflex rather than strategic vision. We're not rethinking our engagement. And I say we, the United States, that's the accent. We, the United States, are not rethinking how we engage with the Pacific Island states. We are still doing it very much through the lens of that strategic reflex. And so there might be an opportunity to look at a different way of engaging in the Pacific, a different modus operandi. So if you think about how things have changed in the past, I just draw, some very simple examples. You think about Nixon in China, you think about the end of apartheid in South Africa, you think about the creation of the euro. Path dependency gets broken up typically by dramatic events, by big changes. It's not often that path-dependent environments change by inches or by increments. Upsetting the world of path dependency doesn't happen with incrementalism. And it's difficult to know exactly how one breaks the pattern. There are things that I think that we could do that would improve Pacific Island policy. I mean, one of the things I would do for the United States is I would create a new U.S. governmental institutional arrangements. Canberra kind of leads the way on this in one respect. Canberra's creation of the Pacific office in DFAT has been a really interesting approach to trying to look at a whole of government answer to the Pacific, to try to bring Pacific voices into one office so that you can streamline communication. Today, in the United States, there are 3 departments that have primary responsibility for the Pacific: the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and the Office of Insular Affairs in the Department of Interior. Those are the 3 main players in the United States when it comes to Pacific Island policy. And they operate on very, very different kinds of language, very different sets of assumptions. The Defense Department has money, they have reach, and they are very happy to go do stuff. State Department wants to do stuff, they'd like to do things, but they often struggle with the financial side. So sometimes, of course, you see state and defense get together, and defense will provide transportation and other services to the Department of State. The Department of Interior is another beast altogether. Their assumptions about how the world works, their assumptions about the things that they need to think about are entirely different than what you would find in the State Department or the Defense Department. There, I can think of numerous times when people in the State Department have been talking to people in Interior and hear stories of what they would describe as Chinese foreign interference, but not described that way in Interior, and Interior not even thinking about having to let other people know about it. Even when, even when opportunities present themselves, folks in Interior sometimes just don't quite get the world that they're operating in. And so state has done a fair amount of work in trying to inform and educate folks in Interior, but their missions are just very different. So one thing one could do would be to resolve those internal differences in Pacific relevant institutions. Maybe an Office of the Pacific that's integrated across departments might be one possible approach. And then the other one is just the perceived institutional importance of the Pacific. It's been described to me numerous times that a Pacific assignment in state and in Interior is how you end your career, not where you start your career. that careers aren't built by engaging in the Pacific. And I find that enormously disappointing. And this goes back to my point earlier about how one engages with Pacific Island countries and how one delivers career returns to diplomats, to others employed to work on the Pacific, seeing the Pacific as important and measuring the importance of a country not by its GDP, not by its population, but by its strategic importance, its relevance to the United States. The other thing I think that one could also change with U.S. Pacific policy is the nature of the narrative. The narrative in Washington today, the one way you can engage people on the Pacific, guaranteed, is to start every sentence with the word China, right? Right? And that's the way you get attention. My concern about that is that, okay, it might get votes in the House and the Senate. You might be able to get work done doing that. But the question is, are you getting the right work done? And are you actually delivering the right answers legislatively when you're having to frame everything around this question of China? Not arguing at all that China isn't important. I'm not arguing that at all. But I'm saying that, you know, a good place to start is with valuing the Pacific because they're the Pacific, as opposed to some other instrumental reason. The last item I'd like to mention is to have a long-term presence beyond electoral cycles. We tend to think about the Pacific in electoral cycles. We tend to think about it as something that happens every 4 years. So rewriting the Pacific Island strategy, reflecting the new institutional arrangements, I think would be a great idea, with also an emphasis on the shifting narratives. The other comment I would make with shifting the perspective on the Pacific is to get beyond funding the compacts. Funding the compacts was really important, critically important. But Pacific debates often end at that point when we're talking about funding the compacts. In 2003, if you go and read the testimony in the House and in the Senate around funding the compacts, the words were, we won't see funding in 2023 because the trust funds will be able to pay the difference. The trust funds will be the funding that will keep those compact countries going. And in 2023, what did we do? We passed new funding for the compacts. Just a sort of a change of perspective. So, you know, what trigger will happen? What will make that change occur? And it's difficult to know what that change is going to be, what the trigger of change for the Pacific Islands will be. I'm sure that if someone from the Trump administration was standing here, they would say, well, we're the trigger. But I don't think they're anything close to the trigger. I think they in fact, are probably more problematic than the trigger. But so it's not clear to me what the trigger will be. But certainly some event could happen that might be the trigger. And here's one that's currently actually in play. You know, the Trump administration, when he came to office in his inaugural address, he talked about expanding the United States. And we've heard about Canada as the 51st state. We've heard about Greenland. We've heard about Panama. But, you know, there's a very serious expansion of the United States that's in the offing. And that is the combining of the Commonwealth of the Marianas Islands and Guam and turning that into the 51st state. Juan Babuta, the former governor of CNMI, was at Trump's elbow the other day in the Oval Office, along with Amata Radowagan, the representative from American Samoa. And I know that Babuta is a great advocate of statehood for CNMI. And I can envision a scenario in which statehood is extended on the belief that it has a deterrent effect. And it also, because it would vote GOP, would also tilt both the House and the Senate increasingly further to the GOP side. So, yeah, so the idea is to actually combine the two together, right? Because there is a bias in terms of size, and you can at least address some of and also I think just the efficiency of two capitals versus one capital, right? I don't know that folks in CNMI and Guam are all copacetic with it, but I think that's one of the thoughts that's floating around out there. Yeah. So that could be a trigger event. It's not one I'm advocating. I'm just sort of thinking about, well, where might this drive occur? So let me turn to a conclusion here. So the U.S. isn't innovating in the Pacific at the moment. It's repeating old scripts. It's just doing what it's always done, right? And Australia, I think, is also enacting similarly old scripts. It's not really innovating. I look at the agreements in Tuvalu and Nauru as simply being more strategic denial by prior consent. I mean, we're wanting to review potential strategic agreements in those countries before they're signed. And, that's a pretty weak form of strategic denial. They can simply ignore you. They don't have to do it. And so I think that again, this is while it's an innovation in Australian foreign policy in some respects, I also think it's just repeating the same script over again. Washington's approach to the Pacific Islands is being tested. And the question is it fit for purpose? Right now, the United States is having a really tough time with relationship with Solomon Islands and also with Kiribati. The plan had been in 2022 to open an embassy in Tarawa. That has not moved ahead. It has been a very difficult row. And equally in Solomon Islands, even though the embassy is open, I think the relationship between Honiara and Washington is difficult and is I think, really being stifled. Whether it's being stifled by Prime Minister Manele or whether it's being stifled by Finance Minister Sogavare, or whether it's being stifled by the Chinese, I don't know, but it's being stifled in one way or another. And so it's not moving ahead. So with that, that's my my talk, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
Okay, we'll have 20 minutes or so for Q&A. So if you do have a question, put up your hand. The mic will come around to you. You may not notice the amplification in the room, but be aware that there are people online listening. So make sure you hold the mic up to your mouth and make sure the red light is on. That means it's going. Anybody? Okay, I do actually have a few, so I'll take the prerogative. So you've mentioned quite a bit that there is sort of strategic inertia or path dependency, as you like to call it. I'm wondering, you read the media of the region, I take it, and you're quite attentive to what's going on there. I wonder if there has been a certain degree of panic or apprehension about the Trump administration, because I do actually get to the Pacific about once a year, and I do talk to high commissioners and ambassadors in Canberra. And under the Biden administration, I actually noticed quite a lot of cynicism among the Pacific community as to whether many of the promises that were being offered would materialize. And there was a very much a let's wait and see, because the Americans do tend to talk themselves up, and then you get a change in government and things change. So I wonder if the impact of the decimation of USAID has been greeted in the region with surprise or shock, because it seems to me that a lot of Pacific Islanders at least tried to position themselves as being used to being disappointed. Right. That's my first question. The second question is about your take on narratives and how you need to change narratives in Washington in order to increase interest or increase engagement with the region. One of the projects that we do is called the Indo-Pacific Cooperation Network, where we take 15 people from around the Indo-Pacific who are focused on disaster resilience to various places, Japan, Australia, and for the last 2 years, the Pacific Islands. And one of the things that kind of hit me this time when we took them to Fiji and New Zealand was uh, the narrative that the New Zealanders built around how they interact with Pacific Islanders. And it was that the normal, if you like, narrative in the West is that Pacific Islanders are kind of benefit takers, right? That they take aid, right? And the New Zealanders were very clear that in disaster resilience, yes, in terms of financial goods, the Pacific Islanders were takers, if you like. But there was a hell of a lot of experience around disaster management that they could contribute to other countries, and that New Zealand worked with them to do that. And I think that sort of narrative where it's not simply that the Pacific Islanders are there, that they actually have agency and actually can contribute something to other countries. I note our friend, the Latvian ambassador, is here. I congratulate the Latvian ambassador on the win to get the UN Security Council seat. I advised their special envoy on the UN when they were there that they should court the Pacific Islanders because the Pacific Islanders vote in a bloc. So there are things, whether it be multilateral diplomacy, whether it be disaster resilience, whether the Pacific Islanders have something to offer. Is there a narrative that fits the sort of Washington ecosystem in that sense that the Pacific Islanders can offer? Thanks.
Yeah, well, let me take the narrative question first. I don't have an instant answer for you, but I think that the idea of when you engage with people, you get to know people and you get to know what they do well and what they don't do well. And you look at what they do well and you say, how can we make use of that? How can you help me? How can I help you? And it seems to me that if Washington had a closer relationship with Pacific Islanders, they would actually be able to talk a little bit about what's on offer and then see where they can actually maybe tap into that wisdom. But you have to know people first. You have to develop those relationships, and the relationships are just really not being formed at least the official level that you would like. You know, there's a lot of talk in the States about the religious relationships between churches in the Pacific and churches in the United States. You look at Mormon churches, Catholic Church, so on, lots of interaction. And that's a place where you might be able to tap into and learn more about the Pacific Island peoples to then see where it is that you can develop that kind of relationship, right? Recognizing the agency and then inviting the agency to be something that you can use or that you can share or so on. We don't have an effective way of how to do that. The State Department is really allergic to doing things in that space, and I can appreciate why it's a difficult space for the State Department to be involved in. They only have one religious program, and it's a program on religious freedom, and I don't think that's an issue that really is of concern in the Pacific. So finding some sort of modality where you can engage with folks, I think, is really important, and I think that was part of the thinking behind the expansion of U.S. diplomatic footprint in the Pacific, was to deepen those kinds of relationships. But there's a whole lot more work needs to be done. You know, if you were to draw out a schematic of what that engagement would look like, you know, you would be expanding programs like Fulbright, but also other professional development programs to create those connections between people. And then that's where you can, I think, really sort of take steps. One of the interesting differences between the United States and Australia and New Zealand in particular, is that conversation is much further along than it is in the U.S. Yeah. Yeah, you know, John Hennessy Nyland, the former U.S. ambassador to Palau, wrote a piece during the Biden administration. It was published by Georgetown, And in there, the title of the piece is "Be Wary of Overpromising and Under-Delivering," and that's, I think, where we are. And I think that's kind of the expectation. Nonetheless, you know, Prime Minister Rabuka did travel to Washington to go to the National Prayer Meeting, National Prayer Breakfast, or whatever it's called, National Prayer Breakfast, in an effort to try to advocate for the continuation of development assistance. Little did he know that the plan was actually to blow up USAID. And so I think that there is a genuine interest in having the United States deliver on its development assistance, on its promises. But, you know, kind of there we are. You know, they built a whole new office for USAID in Suva, and now it's just empty space. It just speaks volumes about U.S. engagement in the region. It is kind of almost a monument to the lack of engagement. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Alan, Rick Smith, I was accredited in a diplomatic sense to the Micronesian states in 1987. So I was interested to hear what you had to say about the differences still between interior and state. We established as best we could a diplomatic relationship with marshals and the FSM in particular, against some reservations in Washington. But we took the view that by pushing it, and we couldn't call me ambassador, we called me minister, as some kind of compromise, we were hoping to goad state into taking over that relationship more. Interior was fine to work with, but they were a sort of a colonial kind of administration. You went to them to talk about money, but we wanted state to push in. I think eventually they did, and eventually they came to appoint ambassadors. But I'm interested that the difference still remains. Is that so?
Yeah, I mean, it's a cultural difference between state and interior, right? And I think you hit the nail on the head when you talk about money, because, you know, really at the end of the day, that's what interior is doing, is it's looking at the management of funds, right? You know, the way the compacts, one innovation has been over the committees, you know, GEMCO, and I can't remember what the other one is called, but the management of funds in each country. It used to be split so that the United States would always have the upper hand in the committee vote, but now it's split 50-50. And so I think the compact states are a little bit more empowered in that space. But back to state and interior, look, I still think there's a cultural difference. I think the only difference today is it's recognized that there's a cultural gap. And so there is an effort on the part of state and interior to try to sort of get over that gap. But institutionally, there is no drive to change anything. The Office of Insular Affairs doesn't want to give away any power, any authority, right? And state really doesn't want to take on another job. Yeah.
And incidentally, the Mikeys, as we call them, are very astute at manipulating that difference and exploiting it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. Long after Trump's body is embalmed and available for viewing by the MAGA faithful in the foyer of the Trump Tower, there are issues relating to the way in which he has proceeded to bring about transactionalism and a values and principle-free American foreign policy, which will continue on in his successors. Two questions that arise at different ends of the Pacific. The first is, what is going to be the US policy going forward with regard to the possibility that the Japanese are going to decide to have an independent nuclear deterrent? That's at one end of the Pacific. And I'm not saying that the Japanese are pushing for that, merely what would be the US attitude towards that. And of course, using your own word, China, to attract attention, China is going to be a century old in its revolution, the year after the Antarctic Treaty expires in 2048. What will be the US attitude towards the Antarctic Treaty's renewal in an age of drill, baby, drill, America first, and where some people are considering that Mars is a suitable place for getting minerals from? Much easier to get them from the Antarctic. So those two matters, Japan and whether it's going to retain its position under the nuclear umbrella, as Australia is, or whether and whether the Antarctic Treaty has any hope of being preserved and renewed in an age of transactionalism?
That's a wonderful question, loaded with all sorts of suppositions and what ifs. And so, you know, what's the what if Japan decides to have its own independent nuclear capacity? An awful lot has to happen between then and now. And you know, right now I'm thinking about Poland more than I'm thinking about Japan in that space. And I suppose that if we ever get to the point that Japan feels the political desire to have its own nuclear capability, the world is very different than it is today. And how would the United States react? Probably pretty negatively. But I mean, it's a what if. I don't know. I mean, you know, I think given a whole set of assumptions on how you get to that point, really, I mean, I can't really answer that question. You know, today's government won't be in power when that happens, if it happens, right? And I don't know what the assumptions are of that government. I can't imagine, though, that the United States will anytime soon be in favor of nuclear proliferation. I can't imagine what that world looks like. And the other question on the Antarctic Treaty, I mean, the Antarctic Treaty has been, to my way of thinking, a wonderful success. I would hope that folks in Washington are always interested in maintaining the Antarctic Treaty and continuing to be obligated by the treaty, and we'll keep the thing alive. Washington doesn't think about the Antarctic very often. I have hosted, so a few years ago, we had a scholar at Georgetown, a guy named Chris Joyner, and Chris was an international law scholar, and anyone who studies the Antarctic would know the name Chris Joyner. It just was a wonderful scholar, a tremendously generous guy. Really the world authority, I think the world authority on the Antarctic Treaty. And he passed away very sadly. He was always very decent to me, and I wanted to remember Chris. The first thing he ever said to me, he said, "Which country were you an ambassador in?" And I thought, well, I've never been an ambassador anywhere, but thank you anyway, right? So I wanted to remember Chris. So I hosted the Chris Joyner Antarctic seminar. And at that seminar, we had Anne-Marie Brady from New Zealand, from Canterbury University, who is in her own right an Antarctic scholar. And her particular interest is China in the Antarctic. We also had David Day, who had written, was really he's a biographer of labor politicians, right? And he wrote this wonderful biography of the Antarctic. And so, which was kind of a funky deal. And so David came and spoke at the seminar. And I can't remember who the third person was. So we got a nice audience for that. A couple of years later, I decided to do it again. And this time I could actually draw on staff from Georgetown, which was really nice. So the provost of the university at the time had been a member of a committee that Congress had tasked with going to the Antarctic and looking at U.S. facilities in the Antarctic to do an estimation of what it would cost to, refurbish the toilets and the sleeping quarters and so on. And then the other speaker was a woman named Sarah Johnston. And Sarah is a wonderful scholar at Georgetown, and she has the coolest topic. And every time I think about her topic of study, I can only think about being her dad, right? So her study is life on other planets. And so what she does, she goes to extreme environments to look at what the archaeological evidence is and the geological evidence is of life in extreme environments as an analog for looking at extreme environments in other parts of the world. So she went to the Antarctic and did a wonderful presentation on that. So we try to talk about the Antarctic. I don't know what the Antarctic, how that will work out. I was just talking to folks in OES at the State Department, and they're very aware of the Antarctic, and they're continuing to focus on it. Yeah.
Thank you, Alan Lee and Dudgeon, AIIA. You use the word Pacific. From an Australian perspective, that's probably the Southwest Pacific. Apologies if I'm croaky. But from a US Pacific, you've got the North Pacific, the Eastern Pacific, if that word exists, or combination of words exists, Southwest Pacific, South Pacific, getting way down to Southern Ocean areas. And the French, of course, straddle from Southwest Pacific into the Middle Pacific. Where does all of this come together in Washington terms?
So, Washington thinks about two Pacifics in the simplest way. They think about two Pacifics: the North Pacific, specifically the compact states. Right? That's the Washington's North Pacific. The United States has a treaty of friendship with Kiribati. The treaty has kind of been in abeyance, but it still hovers around. So you could include Kiribati. I remember talking to a former Trump administration national security official after they left office, who told me of the conversations they were having with it's kind of more Micronesia than North Pacific, conversations of free association with Nauru. And, I think the Trump administration's to the world is free association here, there, and everywhere. But so those conversations are happening. But in Washington, it's the North Pacific compact states and the South Pacific. And the South Pacific is broadly defined to include really the entirety of the remainder membership of the Pacific Island Forum. I don't think Washington thinks about the very far East Pacific. I don't think they think about Chile necessarily in that term. Yeah. But the South Pacific, of course, has become more important in Washington as you hear the refrain, geography hasn't changed. Thinking about conflict in East Asia, thinking about conflict in Taiwan, the refrain is geography hasn't changed. And the same rationale of geography that led the United States to island hop across to Papua New Guinea and Northern Australia and then up, and that logic still, I think, informs a lot of opinions in Washington.
And the French, where do they fit? They're having a meeting in Nice this week, I think.
Yes,
to
yeah.
work out what France and the Pacific is all about.
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, Washington doesn't quite know what to do with the French in the Pacific. In part, it's the complexities of the bilateral relationship with France, and it's also the lack of awareness of French Polynesia and New Caledonia. I mean, there's also a blind spot there, so I don't think they know what to do. Yeah.
Thanks very much. It's a quick question, maybe not a simple answer, but we often use the term Washington as a sort of a shorthand. And part of your story has been about how, in fact, Washington is not one thing. And part of your sort of idea is how to unite. I suppose my question is, so how should we be thinking about this? Like, who do we talk to? Is one way of thinking about, particularly since the chief decision maker and some people close to him, we've seen the sort of the mayhem that can come with different views in that group. Haven't heard much out of that group yet. Is that because it's benign neglect? Just haven't got around to thinking about the Pacific at this point?
Yeah, that's a really
If I think about the sort of the institutional setup.
Yeah. So, there are a couple of peculiarities of the new Trump administration. One is the line of reporting. So decisions are being kicked up very rapidly. So secretaries of departments are now taking responsibility for what would have normally been decisions at a much lower level. There are meeting of principals every week at the White House. So you're seeing principals go to the White House to get the White House, to the president, to sign off. So the decision-making model is really changed quite significantly. You got Gary Quinlan sitting in front of you, and Gary was at the embassy in Washington and could tell quite a story about the role of the Congressional Liaison Office and the recognition that Australia had of these two different points of power, the executive and the legislative branch. Today, the legislative branch seems to largely operate as if it's in a parliament, and that party discipline is really high. The trouble with Washington, the Washington system, with the U.S. Constitution, is that they're trying to have it act like a parliamentary system, but the system isn't designed for parliamentary decision-making. And therein lies quite a bit of turmoil and difficulty. So you ask the question, where is Pacific policy made? I'm not sure. And what's really interesting, I've asked people, where is Pacific policy being made? And the answer I get from people who should know is, I don't know. So it's a really, really odd position to be in. And my concern is that given some of the texture in trying to understand the nature of what U.S. policy is, such as it is, I'm not entirely convinced that the White House actually understands the nuance. And I worry, for instance, about the tuna treaty, because I think that, as I said, that there was, they gave the Pacific exactly what they asked for. Took strings off how you spend that $60 million a year. They did everything the Pacific wanted. And my worry is, and you can hear it, that's a lousy deal, right? They took advantage of us. And my concern is that becomes the rhetoric. That would be a terrible outcome. And I know that there are voices in Washington coming out of the embassy, the Australian embassy in Washington, the New Zealand embassy in Washington, and others, trying to explain the Pacific and all the bits and pieces that make U.S. policy. I have no idea how successful they'll be. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but